the Psychology in Action module, and we're on to lecture number 22, which is mostly going to be focused on assignment support for the essay. So we'll look at the various issues involved, some of which are fairly philosophical notions. Some of them we've touched on in the past. In fact, most of them we've touched on in the past. So this is going to be more of a recap than anything else. And speaking of recaps, we'll touch again at the end on the critical reflection piece that you are going to be uploading tomorrow. Fairly straightforward piece, hopefully, for most of you. If you are having any issues with it, let me know, and we can discuss those through either email or group chat or whatever else seems appropriate. So just a reminder, as we did at the end of last week's lecture, of the 3 essay questions. You just choose one and write an essay on that. I've not heard from anybody in respect to which of these essay questions they're going to do. So it may be that there is one of these questions that nobody intends to answer. But as I haven't heard from anyone, then I'll have to cover explanations for what to put in all 3 of these questions. So only one of these explanations would be relevant to you in terms of whichever question you've chosen. However, some of the information covered for all 3 questions is relevant to any of the questions. It includes notions and concepts that you could work into any of these. So it's worth keeping an ear open, regardless of whether you are answering that particular question or not, because some of the concepts touched on are ones that you could work into other essay questions. So, 3 questions. Positivism argues that the world can be measured through empirical scientific observation with research results as facts. How well does positivism measure emotional states? Or if you don't fancy that one. Interpretivists seek to study views of the world rather than the world itself. How does this shape the choice of methodologies? And the final option, and unfortunately I spotted a spelling problem in this last week when I was preparing lecture notes and so on, which seems ironic. It's taken all these weeks for me to even notice it's there, but the spell check correction thingamajig had altered the correct word, which is the one you've got on the screen here, idiographic, to idiopathic, which is a medical term. So if any of you are answering that particular question, make sure you use the correct spelling, idiographic, the one on the screen here, and not the misprint that you have in your student handbooks. So, last option is research into mental illness tends to favour a nomothetic approach. Explain why it is difficult to use idiographic approaches to this topic. So those are the questions. In terms of how to lay out your answers, start with a paragraph introducing the concepts and the questions. In that introductory paragraph, you need to define the terms within the question. So terms such as positivism or idiographic and nomothetic, those kinds of terms. What do they mean? And how are you going to focus your interpretation on this particular issue? So the particular issue could be emotional states or mental illnesses, whatever it is that you're looking at in that question. And towards the end of that introductory paragraph, name whichever theorists you're going to be particularly referring to and drawing on in the course of your essay. Generally speaking, regardless of what kind of an essay you're writing, that's, as an introduction, that is the standard approach, no matter what the subject matter. Define terms, highlight how you're going to answer it, and then reference the particular theorists whose work you're going to be drawing on in the course of answering it. From there, because this is a psychological essay, other types of subject may differ slightly in terms of the rest of the layout. But for a psychological essay, you then move into your second paragraph, or indeed a couple of paragraphs, in which you set out one side of this argument. So if you're doing that first question, the key issue there is how well does positivism measure emotional states? So you've essentially got 2 answers to that. either it measures emotional states very well indeed, or it doesn't measure them very well at all. So you could set out either one side, yes, it does do well, or the other side, no, it doesn't do well. So whichever side you want to go with first, it doesn't particularly matter. Set out one side of that argument. If you're not doing that question, if you're doing the middle question, then the key issue there is how does this shape the choice of methodologies? So you could answer that by saying one way in which this shapes the key choice of methodologies is blah, blah, blah. You could talk about, for interpretivist methodologies, you could talk about interviews, for example, as part of your first paragraph there. And if you're doing the third question, then the key issue is explain why it is difficult to use ideographic approaches to this topic, the mental illness research topic. So you could say one of the reasons why it is difficult to use ideographic approaches is blah, blah, blah. That would be your first paragraph or couple of paragraphs. From there, you would then, regardless of which of those questions you're answering, move into your second paragraph or second block of paragraphs in which you are considering alternative arguments. So what's the flip side? So whichever argument you gave in the first paragraph, give a different one in this second paragraph or second set of paragraphs. Depending on how much you want to write, you might spread it out over a couple of paragraphs perhaps. So far you've put out arguments on one side, arguments on another side. What you then have to do is move from there to weigh up the evidence. So which of the various approaches you put out bears the weight of evidence? So is the weight of evidence that positivism is good at measuring emotional states, or is the weight of evidence that positivism is not terribly good at measuring emotional states? Is the weight of evidence that one type of methodology is more useful for an interpretivist approach, or that a different type of research methodology is more useful for a relativist approach to research, if you're using that theory, that ontology? Likewise, if you've set out a set of arguments saying, well, it's difficult to use ideographic research in mental illness for this and that reason, is there an argument to be made that sometimes an ideographic approach might actually be useful? And that's your first argument, and then your counter argument to say whether or not the bulk of evidence supports that ideographic approaches are not very good, or indeed possibly that they are sometimes quite good for studying mental illness. And finally, you get to your summary. Your final paragraph in a summary should always be short. That's why it's called a summary. It's meant to be short, to the point, where you just recap your primary arguments. You've said argument A, then you've said argument B, then you've looked at the evidence. This is what it was. This is basically the answer to the question is X, Y, Z. End of. Thank you very much. Upload. I can give you a bit of input and advice on the layout. If you want to send me a draft, I can say, well, you need to move this argument there and put a bit more evidence in for so-and-so argument. So I can do a little bit of that if you'd like, if you get it to me in time, in advance of the hand-in date. What you need to do and work in throughout this as you're going on, particularly in those paragraphs where you're setting out argument A and then argument B, is draw upon theorists. So look to find some backup from people who've written about methodologies, or people who've written about issues like mental illness, for example, or emotional states and how to understand emotional states. What people can you draw upon to back up your idea? So it's not simply saying, here's one idea, here's another idea from your own head. It's trying to back up those ideas with evidence from research that people have conducted. If you can include practical research, so it's not simply saying, well, Freud thought this and Carl Jung thought that, but backing it up by saying they conducted this research project or that research project which showed that, blah, 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 then that kind of hands-on evidence rather than just airy-fairy theory is what's going to get you a higher grade. So that's what to aim for, to set out for. So moving into the first of those questions and the issue of positivism, and also on the right-hand side of this grid, the issues around interpretivism, which apply to the second question, so a little bit of both here. What do we understand of positivism? We touched on some of this last week, but we'll go over this again and think of various different angles. Positivism is a school of thought which says that the real world is out there, it's objective, it's actual, it's real, and it can be measured through scientific techniques. Some of that will apply to sciences like chemistry and geography and so on, but also within the realm of psychology. When we say reality is out there, what do we mean in psychology as opposed to what an anatomist or a chemist or somebody studying a different academic discipline might mean? Well, as psychologists say, is effectively saying that human minds definitely exist, they manifest in various different ways, and they can be measured in various different ways. That's a key feature of positivism, this idea that factors and forces are measurable, accessible, things that can be evaluated and understood, quantified, as it says at the bottom of the grid in the left-hand column. It's a quantitative approach. It's setting out to measure people. Now, you can measure people in different ways. A behaviorist would measure behavior, obviously enough. How many times does a person do something? How long does it take them to do something? How successful are they when they set out to do something? So you're measuring actions that people take. If you're measuring more internalized states like thoughts or feelings, that is a little bit harder. You can observing what somebody actually does, how many times they stand up or sit down, something of that sort. That's fairly straightforward. You're observing a behavior, and behavior by and large is something obvious, it's public, you can see it taking place. Whereas a person can sit quietly in a corner and have all sorts of thoughts and all sorts of feelings going through their head, and it might not always be obvious to an outsider what those thoughts or feelings are. Indeed, certainly when it comes to thoughts, it's very rarely obvious what's going on in someone else's head. So it becomes a bit of a challenge to try and measure those sorts of internal processes. But there are ways in which that can be done, in which scientists can look at methods of measuring experiences which, for the most part, are internal to the individual, going on in their head, rather than obvious measurable things like behavior. There is a degree to which positivism also stretches into other areas. So this notion that human behavior is heavily influenced by society, but also driven by internal biological factors. It can sometimes tend towards an argument that makes some people feel as if they are being treated like puppets that have very little control over themselves or anything else. They're just shaped, manipulated by forces beyond their control. And certainly the humanist psychological tradition has rather railed against positivism for treating people as if they were just trained poodles in a circus with very little control over their own behavior, their own actions, their own choices. But such is the nature of positivism that it lends itself more to things like behaviorism, with its arguments around behavioral reinforcement but through reward and punishment, and arguments such as psychobiology, which sees a lot of human thought, behavior, feeling, etc., driven by neurochemical factors, brain structure, that sort of thing, biological issues, again, which most of us have fairly limited control over, just as we have fairly limited control over grand social forces. What is the aim of a positive approach? Well, ultimately, the aim of positivism is the nomothetic approach, as described or mentioned rather in the third question. It's a nomothetic approach is an attempt to measure people and then make predictions and develop guidelines and rules and regulations that account for human behavior. So when we talk about psychological rules, it's not like a rule or a law passed by government, something you have to do whether you want to or not. Rather, it's saying this is the way human nature works, much as a physicist might talk about the law of gravity. Gravity is not an option, it happens whether you want it to happen or not. So in the same vein, a psychologist might say, well, there are certain laws of human behavior that just tend to happen. This is the way the human mind works, like it or lump it. Once you understand those laws, you can make predictions about how people behave. And again, the capacity for prediction is a key feature of positivism and of research science in general, which tends to be very positivist. The sort of practical aim, practical application of the research is that you'll be able to make reliable predictions about human behavior and human nature by working out what the rules of human nature are in the first place. And we do this by testing, developing experiments in which you can test how someone reacts under certain conditions. And then you retest, you repeat it and you repeat it, sometimes with the same people, usually with a much wider group of other people, to see if what was true of Joe Bloggs, the first person you tested, is also true of Gladys Smith, the 52nd person you've tested. It's that pattern of testing and retesting that leads to a degree of confidence, scientific confidence, in the assumed laws, that this isn't just guesswork, that you really have twigged onto a pattern of human behavior here, that if you do A, you get B as a result. And that then gives you a law, if you like, a rule of human behavior which can be worked with to help change and influence human behavior. Now, whether someone is influencing human behavior for the greater good or for rather dodgy self-interests, well, that's a whole other story again. But you could say a psychotherapist, a counsellor, is trying to find ways to influence human behavior and thinking and feeling and so forth for the greater good, and the greater good of the individual patients and clients who are being treated for their various problems and disorders. You could equally say that someone who works at an advertising agency who wants to manipulate human behavior, control human behavior to cause customers to go out and buy more tins of beans or more cars or more of a particular brand of shoes is again trying to control human behavior, but for a much more self-interested reason there than the psychotherapist is trying to control human behavior. Politicians like to have a crack at controlling the way the public votes and getting them on side and thinking in a certain way and agreeing with certain points of view and opinions. Law enforcement seeks to find ways to rein in the more criminal, destructive impulses of human nature and get people to behave themselves more kindly and more pro-socially. So there's 101 different ways in which we can seek to change behavior, both other people's behavior and, of course, ultimately our own behavior as well in the process. All of that is contingent on the notion that to change behavior effectively, you've got to test and retest to come up with ways in which you can say, I know now that if I do such and such a thing to a person, they're most likely to behave in so and so way. You make a prediction, you test it, and either that prediction works or it falls flat on its face. That's part and parcel of the positivist approach. We'll get on to how that can apply to emotional states momentarily, but just to briefly think of the interpretivist side as the, well, not necessarily the opposite side, because as many researchers will tell you, psychological sciences, just like other forms of social sciences, benefit from having both approaches. So it's not that one approach is brilliant and the other is rubbish. Both approaches are necessary, but necessary under different conditions and for different applications. So the interpretivist approach is more inclined to see humans as free-willed. So it appeals more, for example, to the humanist approach to psychology. And seeks to understand not people en masse, but individuals. To try and see the world as an individual sees the world. Now, that's not the same as saying you have to agree with a person. you have to think that their view of the world is the right view of the world or anything like that. You might be researching someone you think is quite disturbed or unhinged or has a very delusional view of the world, but nonetheless your aim would be to understand how their view of the world has developed and how holding that particular view influences the kinds of decisions and choices that they make. So it's not to agree with it or disagree with it, it's simply to understand it. And the assumption is that by understanding an individual, you'll perceive their drives, their motivations, and again, be able to help change their behavior. So ultimately, interpretivism, like positivism, is still boiling down to this wish to change behavior, destructive, harmful behavior, change it for the better, make it more healthy and creative and positive and so on. But it approaches in a somewhat different way, even though it reaches a similar kind of application. So the assumption for interpretivists is that individual people are really quite complicated, quite involved. It takes a lot of time to get to know someone and understand their worldview and their experiences and their motivations and their hopes and dreams and fears and all the rest of it. Whereas positivists tend to think that people fit patterns. And that's what's true of one type of person will probably be true of other similar sorts of people. So rather than viewing people as individuals, there is more of a tendency to view people as groups, to say, oh, you are such and such a type of person. Now that typology may be, for example, talking about gender. Men behave this way, women behave that way. It could be making an argument about different age groups. Teenagers are more likely to think this way. Retired people are more likely to think that way. It could be a connection to culture or ethnicity or religion or politics. It could be a personality type, to say introverts are more likely to do this, extroverts are more likely to do that. So there's all sorts of different ways in which people can be placed in groups or types. Sorry about that. Bloody telephone there. Where were we? Lost the plot entirely. So yes, people think in different routes, in different ways, and therefore cannot be very easily typed or very effectively typed. So for the interpretivist, lumping a whole bunch of people into a box and saying, because you've got the same sex or the same culture or the same temperament, you lot are very loud and noisy, or you lot are very quiet and retiring, doesn't mean that they will have much else in common necessarily, and therefore trying to make predictions by type for the interpretivist is not a terribly useful approach to understanding human nature. As such, they tend to favour more qualitative methods, things like interviewing and to a point surveying, but more interviewing, case studies, spending a lot of time with people, trying to get to know them, trying to get a deeper insight into them, rather than simply asking a tick box question that's over and done within a matter of seconds. It's more about spending a period of time with them to get a deeper insight, a deeper understanding, a deeper grasp of human nature. Okay. One of the more philosophical questions that's asked here in the difference between these two approaches is this issue of what reality is. Now, as we already said, the positivists view reality as something solid and concrete, which is measurable. And so the reality in this case is the reality of human minds, how other people think and feel and what drives their behavior and so on. That these things are there, they are definite, they can be found, they can be measured, they can be assessed. And by implication, what's true of one person is probably true of a lot of other people as well. Not necessarily everybody on the planet, but a lot of people, which is where we come back to this idea of fitting people into types or categories and saying, well, you're this type of person, and everyone who isn't that type of a person is likely to think in this way, feel in that way, behave in another way, and so on. Whereas interpretivists argue that each of us experiences reality in a different way. And in order to understand how each person experiences reality, you've got to spend time with them doing the things like the interviews and the case studies to get to see their view of reality. And their view of reality is more important than actual reality. Now, to give you an example, I'm sure we must have used this example before because I trotted it out a few times. If Mary down the road believes that there is a goblin living in the rockery in her garden, and she goes out and she talks to the goblin and she leaves the goblin jelly babies, because as everybody knows, goblins like jelly babies, and she interacts with the goblin. Whether or not there actually is a goblin there is, for an interpretivist, not really the point. The interpretivist says Mary believes there is a goblin, she acts as if there is a goblin, she emotionally responds to this goblin, and even if that goblin turns out to be a figment of her imagination, she is nonetheless engaging with it. To all practical intents and purposes, there may as well be a goblin there, because she is acting as if there is one. And so it's not about saying whether or not there definitely is a goblin and whether or not Mary is delusional or is possessed of some singularly rare and unusual experience of encountering this mysterious goblin. Rather, it's saying this is the world she lives in. And in order to understand why Mary does what she does and thinks what she thinks and all the rest of it, you've got to take it as read that she thinks there is a goblin, and then her actions and behaviours and so forth become understandable because of it, regardless of whether there actually is a goblin. So arguments about objective reality, do goblins exist or do they not exist, are of very little interest to interpretivists. Much more interest to positivists, who regard it as important that we see the world as it is, and that world indeed exists in some concrete state where we can make definitive statements about it. And therefore we could say, look, Mary, there's no such thing as goblins. You need to get to grips with this and alter your worldview accordingly, because you are living in a delusional, confused state. If you believe there are goblins, then you're mistaken, and so forth. Whereas the interpretivist would have very little interest in convincing Mary one way or the other about the reality of goblins, and be simply more interested in understanding how this belief impacts her thoughts, her feelings, her behaviours, and understanding the internal world of Mary. Now, moving on to the key issue of that first question, emotional states, and how positivists measure and understand emotional states. There's different ways I put forward here. You might be able to think of more, but there are at least 4 possible ways we can think about other people's emotions, and our own, of course, but from a scientific point of view, it's somebody else's emotions that you're measuring rather than your own emotions. You could look at the neurochemistry, what's going on there in that person's brain when they're happy or sad, when they're laughing or crying or whatever it is that they're doing. And you could monitor fluctuations. Certain chemicals go up and increase in quantity, other chemicals may go down in their brain. It may be that electrochemical activity in one part of the brain peaks, and equally at the same time, electrochemical activity in a different part of the brain subsides. And so you could talk about biological states which can be measured and number crunched and say, this is what's happening in this person's brain, chemically, electrically, etc., when they are feeling a certain emotion. So a measurement could take place. Now, that's not without its own problems, because if you are wired up to various machines that are measuring your neurochemistry or the electrical activity in your brain, it's a very weird artificial experience, and that's likely to have an impact on your emotional state. So the very fact that this peculiar experiment is taking place is likely to have a severe impact on the nature of the emotional state it seeks to measure. So as an approach, it's not without its problems. And you could, if you're doing that first essay, you could certainly mention that as an issue. We could think more in the behavioural context. Is that person smiling or scowling? Are they laughing or sobbing? What are their facial expressions? What are their body postures when they are in a certain emotional state? So you could sit there, and we wouldn't necessarily need to wire them up to a machine, but you could video them or record them, etc. So you can, not only you as a scientist, but you get fellow scientists, researchers, to observe those videos and say, well, the person was smiling for 3 seconds, their shoulders were shaking for 5 seconds, etc. So you could monitor, measure, account for bodily changes in terms of posture, facial expressions, and so forth. And to a degree, you could do a bit of number crunching, a bit of quantitative measure of those physical expressions, outward physical expressions. That's, again, not without its problems. Actors the world over, at least good actors at any rate, fake emotional states when they're on stage. They look as if they're happy or sad or angry or whatever. Are they really experiencing those emotions, or have they just learned to fake the body language? And so it begs this question, is there a distinction between body language and internal emotional state, whereby some people could, not just actors on the stage, anyone potentially, could pretend to feel an emotion they don't feel simply by faking the body language? I'm sure we've all been in situations where we've smiled at someone and pretended to find their jokes funny, even though we privately didn't and weren't experiencing any actual humour. We were just pretending to be amused. Therefore, there's that kind of distinction between outward behaviour and internal experience. You could successfully measure outward behaviour, but it would not be an absolute guarantee that the person genuinely was feeling the emotion internally. And again, if you want to mention that, feel free. There is the potential for self-evaluation. You say to the person, how happy are you? How sad are you? How angry are you? How hopeful are you? And you give them some scale in which to measure themselves. Previous lecture, we mentioned the Likert scales. So you could say to them, on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy do you feel? And they give you a number. That could be done quite straightforwardly, quite easily. It is subject to the person being honest, and it is also subject to the difficulty in making comparisons between individual assessments and assessing across a group. So if Fred says he feels he ticks the number 4 box on the scale of happiness, and Susan ticks the number 8 box on the scale of happiness, can we, in any objective, realistic sense, say that Susan must definitely be twice as happy as Fred because she ticked 8 and he ticked 4? It's quite subjective. These kinds of how do I feel today on a scale of is quite subjective. Do I know that what I consider to be a number 7 happiness is quite the same as what somebody else considers to be a number 7 happiness? It's quite subjective, but you could nonetheless do it as a form of assessment and evaluation. And again, it would give you numbers to crunch. Just as we've mentioned physical behaviours, facial expressions and the like, so we could evaluate verbal expressions. What does this person say? When they're happy, are they saying happy things? When they're sad, are they saying sad things? When they're ecstatic, are they saying ecstatic things? How does their verbal expression, what comes out of their mouth, and that could be both in terms of words, but also giggling or oohing and ahhing and making various other noises. How could we measure that as an understanding of an emotional state? Well, we could certainly do something. A lot of emotions are conveyed through what we say, as well as through facial expressions and behaviours and body language. But again, going back to the issue of actors, there are quite clearly, people who fake it, who pretend to be angry when they're not really angry, who pretend to be happy when they're not really happy. Just because something comes out their mouth isn't a guarantee that they are definitely internally feeling that emotion. They may be faking it. And so there is always that element of there being a problem in the reliability of what comes out of their mouth. But it's still nonetheless a not unreasonable measure to attempt to assess someone's internal state. Or, of course, you could do as a positivist a combination of several of these. It doesn't have to be only one approach. You could combine verbal expression with neurochemistry or with behavioral expression or what have you. So it could be a combination of factors, and a positivist might argue the most reliable approach would be to use a combination of 2 or 3 forms of assessment so that you could match across different forms of assessment and say that there is some degree of consistency going on there. An interpretivist might say you can only ever really know if someone is happy by asking them, and they'll tell you. If they're honest, of course, they might not be honest. But you've got to, as a researcher, rely on their honesty for their self-account. This is their view of their world. How they express themselves might not be the same as how somebody else expresses themselves. So this person might not smile anywhere near as often as that person, but that is no guarantee that they're less happy than them. It may be just that they articulate their happiness in different ways, or their anger, or whatever the emotion happens to be. So the interpretivist would be arguing more for, well, you have to talk to people, you have to ask them, and you have to take their self-revelation to some extent at face value and just have to assume it's true and go with that, rather than trying to marry it up with specific facial expressions or specific neurochemical changes and fluctuations and so forth. So you could bring in those kinds of arguments to that first question. Okay, starting to move into the second question and issues of the interior world and how we understand interpretivist research and how that's related to gaining an insight into people. I've already mentioned interviews. Surveys can be superficial, depending on the way the questions are phrased, but they can also be used either on their own or in conjunction with another type of research method to gain some fairly deep insight into how people think and feel. Likewise, journals where you ask a person to keep a diary, either a handwritten one like in a photograph, or it could be an online blog, something like that vein. And that can include not just written things, but they could do face to camera, you just record themselves talking and so forth. And you ask them to record a journal on some particular issue, how they feel on a number of different occasions, and then you take the collected journal works that they've created for you and analyse them. Archival records is rather than asking someone to write things for you, you find things, written accounts usually can be recorded oral accounts that exist anyway. So they haven't been written for the purpose of your research, they were there anyway. So that could be government papers, it could be medical records, it could be newspapers, novels, just about anything really you care to imagine that might float around and exist in the world of documentation that you could lay hands to and say, well, this is how these people are feeling or thinking or behaving at such and such a point. And the idea behind all of this is to get a real insight into someone's individual life and experiences. Now, one of the key issues here is that all these kind of techniques, the interviewing, the journaling, the surveying, and the rest of it, is contingent on honesty and self-awareness with the person who's being interviewed or who wrote the journal or did whatever they did. So if they know that you, or indeed anybody else, is going to read what they've written or listen to what they've spoken, will they be entirely honest? If it's a private diary, something I keep a diary and I have absolutely no expectation that anyone else will ever read that diary, then I'm quite likely to be honest, because who the hell is there for me to lie to? However, if I know what I am writing or speaking to camera is going to be paid attention to by someone or another, I might be less than 100% honest. I might hold back on certain things I don't want other people to know about. There's something called acquiescence bias, in which people sometimes say things just to please the researcher. They don't believe what they're saying. They just think, oh, well, he or she wants to hear about this, so I'll just make some stuff up about that and keep them happy. So that could be going on. You could have a degree of acquiescence bias of somebody making things up just to please you because they like you as a researcher, or, well, even if they don't especially like you, they may have other reasons for wanting to please you. Equally, there is a bias in which people want to achieve a degree of social respectability, and so they lie. And that tends to crop up more particularly if you're asking questions about rather challenging or controversial issues. So in other words, if you walk up to a random stranger and say to them, are you a raging sexist? What's the chances that they will answer, yes, I am? Quite low. Because these days, maybe not so much 50 years ago, but these days that's seen as a negative thing to admit to. So even if they were incredibly sexist or racist or whatever, they're unlikely to tell you about it because they don't want you to think of them in a negative light. And they know that if they do tell you about it, you probably will think of them in a negative light. Especially if they know that what they tell you may one day end up being published in a book or a journal article. Even if it's published anonymously, you keep telling them it's going to be published and their name won't be in it. Nonetheless, they may still worry, why I really don't want people to know what I think about such and such a thing. Or I have done certain things I don't want to admit to having done. And so they keep quiet. And you get a less than honest answer from them. The other factor of self-awareness, there is an assumption, particularly within the humanist tradition of psychology, that people do understand themselves. Not everyone agrees with that. Freud, for example, is a good example of someone who thought that actually most of us don't really understand ourselves at all. Not at least until we've spent several £1,000s worth of money on getting psychotherapy. Only then will we come to understand ourselves. And you could certainly perhaps sympathise with this if you've ever been in a position where you've done something and afterwards you sat there and thought, why the hell did I do that? And you genuinely had no clue why you did that thing. It's whatever reasoning you had at the time has not reached your conscious mind. Are there people walking around in the world who have very delusional views of themselves? People who think they're awful and dreadful and terrible when actually most other people think they're lovely and smashing and wonderful? Or conversely, people who think they're the best thing since sliced bread when most other people can't stand the sight of them? Of course, there are people exactly like that, people who have very skewed ideas of themselves. And so if you're interviewing a person who has very skewed self-image, what they tell you about themselves may bear very little resemblance to the reality of who they are. However, that said, an interpretivist could nonetheless argue that even knowing someone's rather screwed up point of view is still quite useful because it gives you an insight into their defective thinking patterns, which itself is worth having, even if you don't necessarily get an insight into a more realistic view of them and their behaviour and their thinking. The quote you got there from Watts, working with participants who are unsympathetic or resistant to the aims of a research project can challenge both the integrity and resilience of researchers and can be stressful for both parties. Some people might feel pressured into taking part in research. Perhaps they're a student in a class and one of the other students has arm twisted them into taking part in research they don't really want to do, but they're only doing it for the sake of keeping the peace. Or an employer has told them they've got to take part in some research and they don't really want to. There could be all sorts of situations in which someone feels they've got to participate when they don't really want to. And so it puts up a barrier. They could not want to simply because they're busy, they've got other things to do and they see this as a waste of their time. They could not want to because they don't like the subject that you're researching, and they feel that the questions are rude or prying or something in that vein. It's if they disagree with your politics that underpins the research topic, something in that vein. There's all sorts of possible reasons why they may not be willing participants. Watts looks at the idea of how you get people on side to gradually get them to open up, that you can't just rush in like a bull at a china shop and automatically assume you're going to get honest, full, frank answers from someone you barely know or don't know at all, that you've only just this instant met and you've thrown a lot of questions at them. That there's various methods and techniques, what goes on into them, as to how you build up a rapport with interviewees, you get them inside, you get them to open up, and eventually you get useful information out of them. But it takes time to get that degree of insight and understanding from people. Just before we go on to the nomothetic ones. So if we're talking about this choice of methodologies here for the interpretivist question, coming back to this point here, you might choose these methodologies that we've got on the screen, choose interviews and surveys. Why would you choose those methods? Well, the fundamental point you're coming to here in the essay has largely got to be that these sorts of methods, sitting down and interviewing someone for an hour, you'll probably, let's hope, find out more about them and get a real sense of their worldview than if it's a questionnaire that takes 2 minutes to fill in by ticking a load of boxes. You'll get much less out of them through that way, or conducting some slightly strange experiment with them. You're not likely to get much of an input. And certainly if you look at things like the archival even resources, you could, if it's someone who's written a great deal, you could potentially get an awful lot of information from pre-existing things they've written. You might have someone who keeps diaries, as every month there's a new diary that they've filled in. And that could give you a huge amount of information to work from over the course of time. So there's a great deal there in that the interpretivist is more likely to go for in-depth information techniques than the kinds of techniques like experimentation or short questionnaires that will only reveal a limited quantity of that person's interior thoughts and feelings and views. And you're more likely to get a richer flavour of their thoughts and feelings and views by things like semi-structured questions or completely open interviews where you can leap from subject to subject to subject, rather than being locked into only talking about fixed questions on a structured interview where you've got to ask these 5 questions and only these 5 questions, no matter what kind of answers you get from the person. So even within the realm of interviewing, there is a tendency to favour semi-structured and unstructured over structured interviews. There's a way of getting more information out of people. So moving on to the nomothetic approach, comes to us from the Greek word nomos, which means law. So nomothetic is about creating laws, rules, patterns. And again, it's back to this issue that once you've found your patterns that apply to lots and lots and lots of people, not necessarily every human on Earth, but lots and lots of people, once you've got those patterns established, then you can start making predictions. You can come up with guidelines as to how many people think, many people behave, many people respond emotionally to such and such an issue. So it's all about the predictive capacity, the notion that what is true of this one person is probably true of dozens or hundreds or thousands or even millions of people around the world, rather than being confined to only that one person. Now, if we're thinking in terms of mental illness and mental health research, that research could be used by counsellors, by therapists, by psychiatrists, used to inform and structure government policy and funding decisions made within the NHS, all of that sort of thing. What people at that level want to know is a therapy, will it work for a lot of people? If you've got a therapy that only works for one person on the entire planet, or only works for 5 people on the entire planet, is there much use in investing an enormous amount of time and money and effort into developing something that is of such limited use? Whereas if you came up with a therapy that did a lot of good for 50,000 people or 3 million people, then that would definitely be worth investing a lot of time and money and effort into, because of the sheer volume of people who would be benefited by it. And so you need to know that this thing is good for a large number of people. Now, whether that's a therapy or a medication, something in that vein, or diagnosis. And again, within diagnostic approaches, we have these days used in Britain and many, many other countries around the world, the DSM-5, the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual version 5. Every 15 years they update it with another version. This is like a handbook for psychiatrists who use it to help diagnose mental illnesses in people. And so it comes with lots and lots of different types of mental illness that are listed in the manual, and it says the sorts of symptoms that doctors, psychiatrists should keep an eye open for, that people are more likely, if someone has, let's say, bipolar disorder, they will exhibit this, and this symptom, and they've got to have at least 5 symptoms off a checklist in order to be classed as bipolar or whatever particular condition it is. And so it's a way of saying, well, your symptoms are very similar to that person's symptoms, and that person, and that person, and that person. Therefore, if you've all got similar symptoms, you're behaving in similar ways, manifesting the same emotional reactions, intellectual reactions, behavioral responses, and so forth. If you've got all those things in common, then the chances are your problems have been caused by something quite similar, and maybe can be cured by something quite similar. And so it's there to, nomothetic patterns, particularly in things like mental health, are there for the benefit of large numbers of people. It could help benefit them by preventing them getting a mental health problem in the first place, by recommending ways that people can keep mentally healthy and well adjusted. Or where it's a bit too late for that, it can help diagnose that a person's got this condition rather than that condition because they're showing these symptoms rather than those symptoms. And it can help in terms of suitable treatments, which therapies and medications and so forth work more effectively for people exhibiting those patterns of strange behaviour and thought than people exhibiting some other pattern of strange behaviour and thought. So that's all of the kind of uses outlined here for ways in which people can be helped, can be assisted, can be understood. And it's not only in terms of mental illness. And obviously, for the sake of the essay, the third essay, the focus there is on mental illness. But, for example, behaviourists come to the conclusion that there are certain predictable patterns in what shapes and forms behaviour. So reward works more effectively for most people than punishment does for most people. It doesn't mean absolutely every single person it will work better for, but again, the emphasis here is on most people rather than upon everybody. So if you know that most people respond more to reward than punishment, and you are designing a system of behavioural improvements for a primary school class, or to rehabilitate convicts in a prison, or whatever it might be, then you would have your focus on how do we reward good behaviour rather than your focus on how do we punish bad behaviour. Because you'd be using the information given to you by behaviourist psychologists that in most cases this pattern plays out for people. There's always going to be an exception, but you look at the nomothetic approach, what is true of most people. It's also the bedrock of things like Eysenck's personality research, who said that there are various spectrums of personality, and you can make predictions about people according to where they fit on that spectrum in terms of how they think, feel, respond, what mental problems they have, a whole raft of other issues. And not just Isaac said that, and quite a number of people have looked into it. These days there are 5 major personality traits that are assessed by many psychiatrists and psychologists, and people who work in personnel departments and all sorts of other people to assess personality. And there's a lot of research to support the reliability of these forms of assessment, of fitting people into types based upon their personalities rather than upon, let's say, their race or their gender or their sexual orientation or whatever else that somebody might get lumped into a box over these days. So it's the usefulness for things like prediction and statistical probabilities that nomothetic approaches come in for. It's scientific, number crunching, producing lots of very impressive graphs that can sway people who hold budgets and dish out grants and so forth, are often quite impressed by graphs and charts and such like, even if they don't understand them, and sometimes perhaps especially if they don't understand them. Once a prediction has been made, a person with so-and-so type of mental illness is likely to behave in this way, then so long as those predictions hold true, they can be quite useful for things like diagnosis and treatment, and understanding what people are likely to do in any given situation. Experimental methods, which tend to be more nomothetic than anything, focus on notions of control groups, replicability and experimentation, the kinds of things we've talked about many times in class over the last couple of months. It tends to be favoured by the nomothetic approach. Where it falls down a little bit is with those individuals who don't fit the pattern. So if a prediction is true 95% of the time, how do we understand the 5% of the time it doesn't work? That 5% of people who, for some weird reason, don't behave the way the theory predicts they will behave. Why don't they behave in that way? And sometimes when you look into the research more extensively, you come to the realization that some predictions and assumptions aren't based upon an awful lot of evidence. Or the evidence is sometimes not addressed, not dealt with, because it doesn't go down terribly well. Ellen Pizzey looked into research around domestic violence a few decades ago, and she came to the conclusion that there were as many women beating up their husbands and children as there were men beating up their wives and children. That the focus of the research these days and the targeting of resources and so forth is almost entirely based on the assumption that men are very, very violent and women are not. That women are the victims and men are the perpetrators, which doesn't fit with Pizzey's discovery in her research. So sometimes politics and assumptions and biases can creep into even what is meant to be objective statistical research into patterns. Can and does happen. And there's also this argument made by the humanists and interpretivists that by treating people as types, as fitting into predictable patterns, then you lose sight of the individualism of the person. You start seeing them as just a box rather than as an individual with a full range of thoughts and feelings and emotions. And particularly those people who don't fit the stereotype nice and neatly. Moving on to the ideographic approach, comes to us again from the Greek idios, meaning private, personal, something that's your own and unique to you. And so it's looking at the individual as an individual rather than as a stereotypical representative of a larger group. Not only within humanism, but within right realist sociology, for example, as contrasted to left realist sociology, there is a resistance to lumping people in groups, because frequently people don't want to be lumped in groups, and they object to the groups that they are being lumped into and say, well, yes, I may be of that skin colour or that gender or that whatever. However, I don't feel I have much in common with the other people that you, a psychologist, a sociologist, whatever you may be, are trying to lump me in with. So there is a sort of potential room for arrogance in box-ticking exercises, that we can assume which box somebody ought to be in, even that they want to be in the box at all in the first place, and lump them into categories that they don't want to be lumped into. And even if they do fit into certain categories, they might say, well, I just don't think that category is an important one. So what if I have this particular ethnicity, or that particular sexuality, or that particular personality temperament? I don't think that is particularly important in my life. Therefore, why are you, the researcher, banging on about it? And so the ideographic approach tends to get away from shoving people in boxes and tries to look at the individual as the person they are. And it assumes, more so than perhaps the nomothetic patterns do, that individuals individuals tend to do things for their own freedom of choice, their own free wishes, rather than due to pressures, either external, sociological pressures and forces and conditioning, or interior in terms of hormones and neurochemical drives and so forth. So there is more of an emphasis in ideography on free choice and free will and self-determination, rather than the somewhat more nomothetic assumption that people are driven by their internal biology, or they can be conditioned by external forces to behave in highly predictable ways because of the type of person they are. So as we mentioned earlier, case studies, unstructured interviews and the rest of it tend to be favoured more by the ideographic approach than by the nomothetic approach. On the strength side, there is the recognition that individuals are indeed individuals. They're unique people. They have to be valued and appreciated as they are. You can get a lot of in-depth insight into a particular person, their life, their background, depending on how much time you spend with them and how open and upfront they are. And sometimes the information you get from one person can inspire ideas for nomothetic research with other people. Because again, just to reiterate the earlier point, the nomothetic and the ideographic are not enemies. They are complementary sides of a coin. So they feed into each other, bounce into and out of each other in different ways. On the downside, because you have to spend a hell of a lot of time with individuals to get a truly ideographic understanding of them, it's very time consuming. And as we know, time is money. For people carrying out paid research, it costs a lot more money, a lot more grant funding to get them to do ideographic research than to get them to do nomothetic research. And the results they get can be somewhat more limited because they apply to that one individual, or maybe they've done case studies on 2-3 people, and it's still a tiny number of people to whom something applies rather than a large swathe of people to whom the theories apply. On a purely financial aspect, grant dispensing bodies tend to want, and we've kind of said this already, talk about the NHS and so on, they want information that's useful for many people and will be of benefit to many people. There's very little incentive to spend a ton of money researching something that only applies to 1, 2, 3 people. So they want big scale, useful, widespread useful research rather than severely limited useful research. And so the money tends to go to the nomothetic rather than to the ideographic by and large. So that's a factor there. So going back to this mental illness issue, if someone is researching depression, arguably vast numbers of people suffer depression. If you can come up for a come up with a really good, effective treatment, then that would be of benefit to very, very large numbers of people, potentially, and therefore of benefit to wider society in terms of getting those people to have happier lives, maybe take less time off sick from work, be more engaged members with their family and so on, rather than being too depressed to do anything. It improves the quality of life. There's endless arguments, fairly obvious ones that can be made there. If there is a treatment that's of benefit to 3 people on the entire planet, well, it's nice for those 3 people, but in the grand scale of things, governments don't fund research that's only beneficial to 3 people. Why do we need epistemologies, you might ask? All of this bringing on and on and on about nomothetic and idiographic and all the rest of it. Well, an argument put forth by Lungani and an assortment of others helps to illustrate this. So Lungani here was, in that particular body of research, was looking at the extent to which there are lots of therapies, counselling techniques, psychotherapies, forms of complementary treatment and research, treatment at any rate, therapies, techniques out there in the world, but that a lot of them have very, very little research to back them up in terms of how effective they are. The individual therapist might say, oh, well, I've had 10 clients and they've all got much, much better. But that's very much hearsay evidence, rather than something that's evaluated and assessed and compared with other therapists, weighed up against different techniques which might be more effective or less effective, or much of a muchness. And so Lungani is saying we don't know which therapies really work and which don't. Which therapies are better than others? Are there some therapies that are really good for certain conditions but not much good for other conditions? We need that level of research to go on, and for that research to be unified and held to a common standard, rather than 300 different types of vague, cack-handed, half-assed research projects going on, which leads to what Lungani describes as epistemological anarchy, whereby lots and lots of claims are made. Oh, I know this works because of this reason, because of that reason. But there's very little standardization, regularization, objective scientific assessment between these claims for anyone to be in a reliable position to know which claims are worth listening to and which claims are a load of hot air and nonsense. And therefore, the person suffering from a psychological problem who needs counselling or therapy of some description or another doesn't necessarily know which the best one to go for is, because they can't go to a doctor and say, tell me what the evidence is, tell me which type of therapy is most effective for my problem, because the doctor doesn't have access to such research because it hasn't been conducted yet. So it's quite problematic and limited in lots of different ways. And so Lungani is arguing there needs to be that level of research there to establish which of these therapies and techniques is the most effective. Okay, that's enough on the essays, and if you do have any additional questions that haven't been addressed, then obviously email me or raise them in the chat function, or if you would prefer something like Zoom so we can see each other rather than just typing to each other, let me know and I'll set up something for that. The reflexivity, we went over all of this last week in last week's lecture, but just to reiterate, you're reflecting, and you can, for once, use the word I. You don't have to stick to the third person as you would do for an essay. A reflexivity section is your own view of yourself. It's just like that journal we mentioned a few minutes ago, you writing for your own benefit about your own experiences and your own insights. While I say it's for your benefit, some of what you say might be useful to me to know about in terms of improving the way things are running in future years on this particular module. So if lots of you turn around and say you found getting support from Anita or Ben the best thing since sliced bread, then I can pass that information on to the college that we need a lot more of that. And likewise, if some of you say, oh, I listened to I know, TED Talks on YouTube, but they were a load of old rubbish and not much use to me, then I would know not to bother recommending those to people in future. So it gives a bit of useful feedback for me, as well as helping you to reflect on your own learning and think to yourself, well, I know doing this thing was really helpful for me, so I'll do more of that in the second year. And equally, I know that doing that other thing was a load of old rubbish and a waste of time, so I won't bother doing that in the second year. So it's a bit of mutual use and support, partly for you and partly for me, a two-way street there. But I don't think there's much point me reading through these subheadings again, having gone through them all in last week's PowerPoint. But it's just that process of you thinking about what worked for you in terms of learning, what didn't work for you, what kinds of topics are a real struggle for you, what kinds of topics are nice and easy and straightforward. So did you find the maths really hard or really easy or somewhere in the middle? Did you find getting to grips with all these convoluted jargon terms like ontology and epistemology and positivism? Did you find that dead easy, or did you find it a real challenge? If you found it a challenge, did you eventually come up with some way that would make it easier for you? Maybe just hearing about it again and again and again in lectures until it sunk in? Or did you find writing down notes helped it to sink in better than listening, or some other technique? It's thinking about those sorts of things that you can mention. You don't need to provide references or anything like that, because this is you reflecting on your experience. You're not trying to dig up research to prove your experience is true. So that's the aim, the goal. That's what we're setting out to do. Now, next week's lecture is the final one, which I'm sure you'll be relieved that you don't have to listen to my voice over the summer, and be a relief to my throat to know I don't have to keep wittering non-stop at a camera. In the final lecture, we'll start thinking about the second year, what you need to prepare for the second year and think about and get ready for in the second year, and how things change between first year and second year. I know dissertations are a long way off, a couple of years ahead, but to start bouncing around a few possible vague notions you might mull over, think about, have floating in the background. Now, if we were meeting up in person, we'd be organising tutorials, small group tutorials, one-to-ones, that sort of thing. We can still do that, except obviously we'll have to do it virtually through either Zoom or the group's facility or whatever. So if you want a bit of feedback for any of the assignments or for your future planning and thinking about what to do over summer, etc., we can do all of that way. But we'll end it here, and hopefully you're all well and you're all okay, and I will organise a time for a group chat catch-up. It'd be nice to hear from some of you, particularly the ones who haven't been able to participate in those chats so far, just to know that you're all alive and well and okay. Take care, stay safe.